Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Concussion Nerds podcast. In truth, I was trying to wait until my voice was fully back to its restored self before I filmed this episode, but alas, this is the best I have sounded in 5 days, and so here we are. You get to deal with my hoarse, froggy throat. I do hope you're having an amazing start to your week, and for those that didn't know, we kicked off a new workshop last month. It was called Rethink Rehab. And we had great kind of summary feedback from it. And so we're doing it again. Rethink Rehab is for physical therapists, chiropractors, athletic therapists, acupuncturists, health professionals who want to have greater confidence in working with concussion, who want a foundational approach and understanding the Concussion Nerds framework, but aren't quite ready to jump into Concussion Nerds fully yet. So if that is you, the link is below. We are teaching this live again on February 28th at 9 a.m. Pacific, and you will have lifetime access to the replay and any other future content that I do in this regard. So check that out. You met Rachel last week. So Rachel's going to be joining once a month on the podcast. And we talked a little bit about the vestibular system and the VOMs in particular and some elements that we see in assessment a lot. And today we're going to take it back a step and we're just going to talk about the art of assessment and how important the assessment is. And what I see happening in clinical practice a lot and what I really want to try and steer us towards too. It is truly a huge piece of when we talk about an integrated multi-systems approach. And when I talk about integrated multi-systems approach, I'm talking about from point one, from assessment, right? When we start to look at the statistics, and you guys know these, 85% of individuals have headache as a symptom after concussion. 85%. The most common singular phenotype, if you're going to actually break it down, and there is actually only a singular phenotype, is anxiety and mood. The most common mood symptom, though, that you will see in a study that looked at different athletes was actually irritability, was the most common mood symptom that was found in questionnaire. When you look at the phenotypes as a whole, 1/3 of individuals experience the vestibular ocular when you group those together phenotype. That's only 1/3 though. When you look at another study, I believe it was by Letty, if not, it was another group that then looked at Letty. They assessed a group of adolescent athletes and found that 70% of them experienced autonomic dysfunction. But when you look at the persistent concussion, I'm going to tell you there's 2 areas that get missed all the time. All the time. And the other piece that happens, and this is nobody's fault, because in truth, I always say to someone, we cannot silo the human body, right? We cannot break us into segments and treat a segment. We can't silo us. We are a full integrated being. Yet our healthcare system and our medical system is literally created in silos that don't talk, right? You look at it, like that's just how things are created. And so what happens in this concussion space all the time is that someone comes in for an assessment. Okay, so they tell you they may or may not have hit their head, right? We know that that's not required. And they come in for their assessment, and you in your due diligence as a clinician are asking all the appropriate questions. What makes their symptoms worse? What makes them better? What are they noticing? Is there a previous concussion history? Is there medications? All these other pieces. What was the initial symptoms you had? How are you feeling today versus right the time? So we really do want to do this in-depth subjective assessment. We'll talk about subjective part. We'll talk a bit more about that in a second. And then we want to do an objective. And we need to do the objective because the subjective doesn't tell us everything. It tells us a lot, but it doesn't tell us everything. And now here's the thing. When we start talking about symptoms and we start talking about phenotypes, they overlap. They absolutely overlap. And then what happens as a clinician is if we are a vestibular therapist, vestibular is always our bias, right? If you're a vestibular therapist, vestibular and oculomotor screen is your bias. If you're an orthopedic therapist, cervical spine is your bias, right? If you're a neurological physical therapist, vestibular vision autonomics is your bias, right? We all have a bias. But what we need to be doing is assessing beyond our bias. Because what happens is we assess the area that we are most proficient in, that is our favorite, and then we find issues And then you stop and you don't look at the rest of the systems. And this is what sets your client up and you up, honestly, for frustration. So when we're looking at the assessment, we obviously start with a subjective and then we move to objective. So how are we doing that subjective assessment? Obviously, using tools is super helpful, whether you're using the Rivermead, whether you're using the clinical profiles screen, whether you're using the concussion symptom scale, right? There's multiple different ways to do it. We use a system in my clinic called C3 Logics, right? C3 Logics lets us do a symptom scale. It lets us do the standard assessment of concussion. And then it actually also lets us do a cognitive screen as well, right? So we use C3 Logics to track symptoms in our clinic. But you do that subjective piece, and then you get to dig deeper, right? Ask the questions. You're going to ask, obviously, and you know this, guys, how did the concussion happen? What were your initial symptoms after concussion? What are you experiencing today? And then go deeper. What makes them worse? What makes them better? When do you notice them aggravated? When do you feel the best during your day? Are you noticing a pattern or a trend to your symptoms? If you're talking to a female, can I ask where in your cycle you were when you had your concussion? As in, were they about to have their period? Were they on their period? Was it in the second half of their cycle? Are they on birth control? If they're on birth control, can I ask what type of birth control? Is it a progesterone-based birth control? What type of hormonal birth control are you on? Right? These things matter. What other stressors are going on in your life at the moment? What supports do you have at home? How is your sleep? How's your nutrition? How are you eating? What else have you noticed about yourself since the concussion? I say this one and I ask this one because when you start just asking about symptoms, sometimes people don't necessarily think of what to say. But when you say, what else have you noticed about yourself? Have you noticed anything different about yourself since the concussion? That's when I start getting answers like, I'm finding it harder to concentrate in school. Or I notice my heart rate feels like it's racing all the time and that's new for me. Or I'm having a really hard time with, like, I'm just feeling myself feel really impatient with people. That's when it starts to just kind of open the door for a broader open-ended question for then you to kind of dig into. We also want to know if there's a previous concussion history. And if there was a previous concussion history, the next question is, did you get rehab for those concussions or did they resolve on their own? Why are we asking this question, right? So our brains are amazing tools. They are amazing, amazing things. And if someone has a previous concussion history and they've never had rehab for those concussions, I'm not saying it's guaranteed, but it is possible that their brain was able to compensate for a dysfunction from a previous concussion that now this current concussion may unveil, right? This current concussion may knock out the compensation strategy. So you're going to deal with the new issue plus the previous issue from previous concussions, right? So that question of what is the previous concussion history? Did you have rehab for those concussions? And how long did recovery take from those concussions, right? Was it quick for all of them? With every concussion, are you noticing an increasing timeline of recovery needed? We want that information. We also want to know past medical history. So is there a previous learning disability? Is there a previous migraine history? Is there previous motion sickness, right? We know that pre-existing migraine or headache challenges or motion sickness is a yellow flag for longer recovery symptoms. Is there pre-existing anxiety or depression? Again, it's not a guarantee, but it's a yellow flag for longer recovery. So we really want to do that really great subjective assessment. Use client symptom scales to help you get that too. It's a beautiful way to just to trend and track, but then do your due diligence to ask those deeper questions as well. Then you get to move into your objective assessment, right? That got us a really great question. I am co-facilitating right now a course, concussion competency management course. I am co-facilitating a course right now with Neuro 360, and it is a 6-week case-based concussion course. So if that interests you, so many concussion courses here. I love it. If that interests you, visit Neuro 360. We have another cohort going in the fall. But someone asked me a really great question on one of our coaching calls the other day. They said, do you do the Buffalo concussion treadmill test or a bike test for persistent and acute concussion assessments? And I said, My acute concussions is one of the first things I do, because after all of this piece, we know that the literature supports over and over and over and over and over again in acute concussion, getting our individuals moving in a subthreshold supported way, right? So some form of exercise test, whether it be the Buffalo Concussion treadmill test, bike test. Full disclosure, I always use a bike for multiple reasons. That is usually appointment 1, or it's a 1 or 2 within my acute concussion assessment. And my persistence, it is not, because my persistents are persistent for a reason. And we know that when someone is shifted into a persistent state, it's typically because there is dysfunction or challenge within another system. And so that other system can absolutely also be contributing to the presentation of the autonomic component. And so there are more ways to assess the autonomic nervous system than the Buffalo Concussion treadmill test or bike test. That is one way to assess for an autonomic concomitant of concussion. It is not the only way. So we use other ways to assess the autonomic nervous system in persistent concussion and acute concussion. I truly hope with your acute concussions, you are at a minimum doing a lying to standing blood pressure test, in addition to the Buffalo concussion or an exercise test. But in the persistent, no, the exercise test is definitely not the first or second thing I do. It is other tools to look at the autonomic component. Again, when I talked about when we're moving into that objective stage, right? There's this belief in I feel like in our professions that if we don't treat, if we don't get our hands on the client, if we don't give them something right away, we are not giving them value. And I want to stop that and halt it and change the narrative on that right away. Because you need to have all the information before you start giving things out, right? And so what if, and again, I'm just lumping all concussion together here. What if that first assessment isn't a rush to begin a treatment plan, but instead it's focused on the education management tool? And if you can give something for treatment because you have a clear understanding of what the root driver is that's driving these symptoms, then you can. But if you need 2 appointments to do that, then take the 2 appointments, but educate your client on why, right? So when we're looking at the assessment of the acute, and I'm going to start here. The assessment of the acute, what is key is that we are still screening all the systems. Don't just stop at the VALMs and the concussion treadmill test. It's not enough. It's not enough. Too many times I've had people be like, I cleared the Buffalo concussion treadmill test, so I was told I didn't have a concussion. No. The Buffalo concussion treadmill test clears 1 of these 7 phenotypes. So in that acute stage, you must, in your toolbox, have an assessment protocol that at a minimum screens for all 7 phenotypes. You could say 6 because, again, headaches is a phenotype, and to me, a headache is a symptom because it can be a driver for many of the other ones. But you must have the tools, and you must be screening for all 7 phenotypes, because if you are not, you are missing something that could then contribute to a longer recovery. Point blank. There's no other way to say it. So in that, when you're doing that assessment in the acute, yes, the research supports over and over and over again, let's get them moving as quickly as possible, which is why for us, our acute assessment is 2 sessions in 1 week. Session 1, education, because it shows us that there is absolutely levels of increased anxiety when acute concussion comes in because they just don't understand what's happening and there's uncertainty on how things are going to move forward. Session 1 at a bare minimum is education and aerobic exercise. That is what needs to happen in session 1 to get them going. If you can start to get into the rest of your system screen after that, amazing. And if you can't, the rest of the system screen is session 2. Also, we want people in the clinic ideally between days 4 and day 7, or day 3 and day 7. So you bring them back and you do the rest of your system screen. And when I say you're looking at your system screen, you are pulling into your toolbox to assess for the vestibular, the ocular motor, the cervical spine, cognitive, affective, And we also assess somatosensory and persistent. So you must have those tools. And if you're sitting here thinking, yeah, check, like, oh, I don't really have much to assess for whatever phenotype, then you need to brush up your skills. When people start to shift and show up in the persistent stage, sometimes it's because there's multiple factors happening and there's some complexities in the interactions and all those pieces. Persistent is almost, I always say, it's never just one thing when someone is shifting into a persistent stage, right? We absolutely need to take a step back and do more of a holistic approach with our persistent clients from a multitude of different reasons and multitude of different angles and examples of what we're doing. But also, when someone shifts into persistent, there are fundamentally things I see missed over and over and over again. And I might seem like a broken record, but the two areas that don't get the focus and lack the integration piece over again is almost always an autonomic component and a vestibular component. Because our vestibular system does so much more than just being able to keep our eyes stable while we move our head. It is so much more than just the vestibular ocular reflex. And over again, I see elements of both these two systems missed in our persistent concussion clients. Or when it comes to building treatment as therapists, we're just trying to do too much too soon. So often I have to bring people back. And so when we're talking about identifying the missing pieces in concussion evaluations, a big piece of it in the beginning is actually, it sounds silly, but we're not doing a full multi-systems assessment. That is step one. And that is the step that I am still seeing missed over and over and over again. And it's because, honestly, that's not how we're trained, right? You take an amazing vestibular course and you're trained on how to do a kick-ass vestibular assessment. You take a cervical spine course and you're trained on how to do a really awesome cervical spine assessment, right? You take a vision course, you're trained on how to do a pretty cool vision course, and no one comes and puts it all together for you. But that is what we must do in concussion. When I talk about someone being a concussion literate provider, it is somebody who can look at the whole picture. That doesn't mean you're the one that treats everything necessarily, because there's a lot and we need a team. Concussion takes a village. But it does mean you have the understanding of the full scope, the full systems, and you understand how they integrate and how you can support that person by either referral or treatment. We cannot be a concussion expert off of one weekend course. It is impossible. We are constantly learning. And to truly understand how someone is impacted with concussion, we also need to understand what the normal neurophysiology looks like to understand what looks different. You are treating the entire whole person in front of you. But when I say what is missing in the art of concussion assessment, it is simply that. We need to be doing a better job of looking at all of the systems together. What is working well in that system? What is not working well in that system? And how are they integrating and speaking to each other? If that is something that is not your strength and you're listening to this, then either looking at Rethink Rehab, looking at Concussion Nerds, that is what I teach. When I do consults for individuals, one of the first questions I will ask them is, guide me through your journey. Share with me what you've done in terms of rehab. And a lot of the time, they've done bits and pieces of the different things, but they haven't had the opportunity to work with someone who can look at the whole picture and bring it all together in an integrated fashion. That is what concussion requires. So, when we're looking at building out our assessments, we start with a subjective. Ask open-ended questions. Ask the deeper questions. Listen to what they're saying. Get a solid history to help guide you. But then know that you're also, regardless, you're going to do the full multi-systems assessment. You are not going to skip one because you don't think it's relevant. You're still going to do it. You might not need to go as deep, right? So you're going to screen. And in the screen of all the systems, you can then decide if you need to look deeper into one of them. But do not skip one because you think subjectively it doesn't fit. This is how things get missed. My voice is starting to go, so I'm going to wrap this one up. Until next week, my friends, I wish you a wonderful day.
That's today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you liked what you heard, give us a like, give us a share, give us a tag on Instagram, and please never hesitate to reach out. We love communicating and connecting with you. Until next week, my friends, have a marvelous day.